This show talks about books that feature mental health and mental illness topics. The discussion will be from the point of view of mental health professionals. There are many books that include this topic, and my hope is that more and more people know about them because they help to decrease the stigma and help people not feel so alone in their struggle. I am your host, Robin Tamanaha, licensed marriage and family therapist. Joining me on this episode is my guest, Jill Johnson-Young. Jill wrote the book, Your Own Path Through Grief, a workbook for your journey recovery. Hi, Jill.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I am good, thank you. It's Friday while we're recording this.
Yeah, TGIF.
That's exactly right.
Well, thanks so much for being here. I like my guests to introduce themselves. So would you like to say a few things about yourself?
Sure.
Like who you are, what you do, anything you'd like the listeners to know about you?
Sure. I am a licensed clinical social worker, and my MSW is from the University of South Florida, which I love to say because it's a fabulous school. And if you're in California, it's a better buy than the California schools. I also co-own a large practice in Riverside and Murrieta, California. We have about 30 therapists now. I co-own that with Sherry Shockey Pope. She does practice building. I do all the fun stuff, all the clinical stuff that I love to do, which is why I love our practice. It gives me the opportunity to write and lecture and do those things. My focus is grief, loss, death, dying, dementia, all the fun stuff that most people, when I say it, they sort of take 3 steps back. Wow, that's interesting. And then there are always a few who want to come up and talk about it and share their experiences and want to know how to do better. And I do what I do because I was a hospice social worker for well over 10 years and a hospice director. And I did that while I was in grad school, by the way, and driving 90 minutes each way to school at night. And when we got into private practice, after we were done doing all the building and seeing all the clients from everywhere, no matter what, I was able to move into doing grief and loss and doing dementia. I also do dementia. I do grief and loss because I was raised in a family that really did grief and loss as a normal part of life, which I think has made me a better therapist. I grew up with, every time a cricket died, we had a cricket funeral, when a neighborhood pet died, we had a group funeral and everybody brought flowers. And I had older parents, so I had relatives who were dying when I was just a tiny youngster. And that was normal. That was just part of life. Since then, I also have been widowed twice before the age of 50. My first wife died after 23 years, and we had 2 kids we'd adopted by then, and I adopted our 3rd child after she died. And while she was dying, she was a nurse. She became good friends with one of her hospice nurses because, nurses are kind of a clique like therapists are, understand each other. And so they got to be good friends. They'd like to drink Yoo-hoos together and eat M&Ms. And she told that hospice nurse, whose name was Casper, that she needed to come back for me afterward. And we told her to shut up. And it turns out she was right. So we married after Linda died. Linda had been sick for a long number of years. She died of pulmonary fibrosis, which was brought on by chemotherapy from breast cancer 10 years before. So we thought she was going to die 10 years before she did. And she beat stage 3 cancer with 14 positive nodes. We got 10 extra years. We were very grateful for that. But when you have the chemo they use for that, it does damage to your heart and to your lungs. So she ultimately died of pulmonary fibrosis. We had a long time to get ready for her death. And then I was married to Casper, and she started acting weird after not too long, and it turns out she had Lewy body dementia, the onset. That's what we lost Robin Williams to, and that's why he made the decision that he made. So, and then during the time that Casper was dying, Casper and I became friends with the funeral director who'd taken care of Linda and had met Linda while we made her arrangements. And she came back and helped take care of Casper because, when you get remarried after you've been married a long time and you're a widow, you're breaking all the widow rules and you totally piss people off. And they don't understand that when you've had a long loss, that griever, that primary griever has actually finished their grief within about the first 3 months after the death. There's lots of research to support that from places like Johns Hopkins. So when we got married, Casper and I lost a number of people in my life, and Stacy stepped in and became a good friend. And so now I'm married to the funeral director who took care of both my previous wives. So I keep them close. And because she's a funeral director, we do grief and loss at work. And then we do grief and loss in the evening while she's embalming at night. She also just got back from being deployed for COVID with the National Disaster Mortuary Team. So yeah, that's probably a long introduction, but it says a lot about why I do what I do.
And that was going to be my next question is I could see, how your experience, even just personal, the path has kind of led you maybe to where you are now in the work that you do. Like it, and I could almost picture like your experience in a way. Some of those may have been helpful for, being a therapist when someone's going through grief.
Yeah. It's not that my experience is their experience because everybody's loss is so unique.
Mm-hmm.
But it does make me, I think, a more aware therapist. And I teach grief and loss to therapists and death and dying to therapists because they don't teach us that in grad school. They teach us 5 stages and tell your client they're going to grieve forever. And then they see stuff on social media that says helpful things like, you'll never stop grieving because you love them that much. So the opposite is, well, if you're not grieving anymore, then you must not have loved them that much. So I teach, I love to lecture. I lecture nationally and internationally on grief and loss for therapists in allied health because we need to do it better. We need to be highly aware. We need to be aware that loss of intimacy is a second loss that's separate and apart from the major loss. And that if we don't talk about it, our clients won't talk about it, but our clients want to talk about it. I've done some research on that. It's present. 100% of them said they wanted to talk about it. 100% of therapists I polled said they would never bring it up. They wait for the client to bring it up because they don't want to embarrass the client. So the client's embarrassed if they bring it up because, God help that I talk about missing intimacy after my spouse has died because you're going to think there's something weird about me. And the therapist is feeling uncomfortable bringing that up. And so it's like the elephant in the living room is huge there. So I do a lot of lecturing because I want therapists, to know what the dying process looks like so they can help re-educate their client. And I want them to know how to talk to their client and how not to talk to their client. I wrote the workbook because I wanted all of us to have a tool to use, and it uses the process I use with my clients. Kind of in your face, solution focused. Let's get this done.
Yeah. And I have the workbook and it's wonderful. And yeah, when I read through it, it's definitely like, is that a workbook, but also very like user friendly. There's a lot of, different prompts, which, is so helpful,
Grievers don't like blank pages. You tell someone who's grieving, go home and write in a journal, and they look at that page and what? Mm-hmm. Give me a prompt. I can write about it.
Yeah. So could you tell me a little bit, since you brought it up, about, the therapy process, let's say with grief, and whether or not the therapist themselves has experienced a significant loss? What does it kind of look like? Or is it even different, or when the therapist has experienced a significant loss or multiple, let's say?
I think first we need to be aware of therapists what loss is, because it doesn't have to include a death. By the time we get big enough to go to grad school and have licenses, we've had at least a few losses. We've lost friends from grad school when we finished. We've moved. We've left parents. We've had some losses. Yes, I think it does make you a better grief therapist if you're in touch with that. And it makes for a better experience, in my humble opinion, for grief clients when they know that you understand loss. And it could be something like a pet loss. As we're talking, I'm holding Adele on my lap, and Adele's going to be put to sleep tomorrow because she's very old and very sick. That's a loss. That's a loss of a family member. And I know that clients like their grief therapist to be more transparent. When you have a client coming in and they're talking about anxiety or depression, you're not going to share your history of anxiety or depression. Right. They don't need to know that you've had that. There's no way that a grief client's going to come in, sit down with you, and when you start asking them about stuff and you're not disclosing that you experienced loss yourself, they're going to know that you're not being honest. And that's going to shut them down. They want to know, they don't need to know the particulars. They don't know the specifics of how my wives have died unless they've read my websites, but they know I've had losses, and it makes it easier for them to talk.
Yeah, almost inviting in a way, or making it like comfortable, you
Mm-hmm.
know? Because yeah, like you said, like if both parties are kind of not bringing up the topic, then how does it ever,
You're skirting.
get worked through? Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So let's kind of dive maybe into, maybe for the listeners, just some foundational stuff like the grief process and kind of like what that looks like, because I think there may be, whether it's internal, like
Mm-hmm.
expectations or thoughts of what grief looks like, or maybe from others who may think they are being helpful by what they're saying and putting on, saying certain things that maybe this is what it's supposed to be. So kind of like, can you maybe break it down like briefly, kind of just what does the grief process like actually, look like?
Okay. What it doesn't look like is stages. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was amazing, and the work she did was foundational, but she worked on anticipatory grief. And that's where stages fit. When you are doing hospice care for someone, or you're working with a client who's dying or has someone dying, then absolutely you're going to talk about bargaining and anger and sadness and acceptance. Because when you're dying, at some point you got to accept that you're dying, because there's no way out of this one, right? Miracles don't typically happen when you're at advanced stages of illness. But when you are past that point, when you are the survivor, what it looks like is the first few months or weeks, depending on how the death occurred, there's some shock, even if they knew that the death was coming. There's getting through all the stuff that surrounds a death initially, which has changed now with COVID because we can't do those things the way we used to. So we're going to have to redo those things for clients after they're allowed to finally have a funeral. And we're going to have to remind them that even though their loved one may have died 4 months ago, they still need to have the service, because that person still died and it's still a huge loss in their life, and that person should be remembered, right? We need to start saying the person who's died's name. When you've gotten through that part, and part of that working with a grief client for me is also sitting down and making sure they're paying their bills. I'm a social worker after all, because you have this whole, your brain is fuzzy, you can't remember things, you don't sleep at night. No griever sleeps through 2 a.m. There's a whole host of impacts of grief cognitively and physically and emotionally and spiritually. And as therapists, we need to be able to talk about it with our clients so they can know that they're not crazy, because that's what they want to hear. I'm not going crazy. This is normal. What they're hearing from people outside is, you're not doing it right. You're not angry. You haven't done all the stages. You have to do the stages to be done. No, utter BS. You don't have to. You have to finish what's left over. And that's what I do. When I first meet a grief client, the first 2 sessions are just them telling me their story. Tell me what happened, and I hold space. And if you're not good at holding space, it's uncomfortable, because they need you to just be there and absorb what they have been through.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's some re-education about, if they thought their loved one was gasping for breath, no, that was Shane Stokes breathing. They were having a normal dying process. They weren't experiencing it. You were. They weren't hearing it. You were. Hear your voice. They couldn't hear what their body was doing. They weren't in distress. It was distressing for you because somebody didn't educate you in time. Right? So there's a whole lot of re-education that goes on. I ask them always what stuff they've heard that's not been helpful, because there's always that. And that's because people want to fill up space with sound. Therapists will do it too. Well, they're in a better place. Aren't you glad it's over? Okay, they might be glad it's over, and that's normal. Follow that with, does it make you feel guilty? Because it does. And the guilt is misplaced because it was exhausting and it was time for them to go. Let's talk about the guilt, because the guilt is coming from, what should I have done differently? What decisions did I make that I'm second guessing? What are people questioning me about? Right? Because there's also people always who are telling you that you did something wrong. You mismanaged this dying process. You didn't do the right thing. As an example, when my second wife was dying, Lewy body dementia is a particularly terrible way to die. And we had her advance directives done in her POLST, her physician's order regarding life-sustaining treatment. She made all the decisions. She was a hospice nurse. Right? She knew exactly what she wanted. We went 37 days without food and fluid. And if you don't think that was hard, and I was a social worker with hospice, I knew that this was normal. I knew her body was shutting down. She was just too young to be dying. But 37 days is a long time. And I looked at that post form over and over to reassure myself that I had done the right thing. We'd had very clear conversations about it. But then, of course, after she died, there were always those who said, you did what? Why didn't you? The questioning that goes on. I knew better than to listen because I knew what was going on. Most people don't. Very few people are a hospice social worker and a hospice nurse together facing a death. That doesn't happen very often. So we were in a particularly good position to understand it. So I asked them what stuff have they heard, who said it, and I let them vent it. There's a lot of venting in grief work because they can't vent to anyone else because the people they love and trust are the ones saying this stuff to them. You know, give it up to God or whatever the belief system is. They're usually not happy with God or a higher power at that moment because their loved one is dead. So, and if you're implying that God had a hand in it, there's a grief card I like that said, if God has a plan for everything, he's a really bad planner. You did pretty good with unicorns and things, but this whole death thing, not so much. So there's all of those things they need to talk about. And then we work on what's left. What didn't they get to say? What apologies should they have heard? Because nobody who dies is perfect. We work on who really died, not this fake angelic person that everyone else turns them into. Because grievers, particularly primary grievers, are told in example, if not in terms of real words, you can't remember them with faults. They're dead. I'm not perfect. You're not perfect. My dad wasn't perfect. My wives weren't perfect. I fully expect my kids to talk at my funeral about what I turned into when I came home and there were dishes in the sink. Because that's who I am. That is my, you want to piss me off? Leave the dishes dirty in the sink when I get home from work. Right? I also expect them to talk about how odd their mom was in dressing all of her poodles in dresses and cute little kids. That's who I am. Not perfect. Funky. You have to give your griever the chance to remember who really died and then to finish those pieces because then they can reorganize their life without their loved one, figure out where they want to go. Vision boards are an amazing piece of doing grief work. Never in your life do you have the permission to redo everything in your life except when someone important has died. And never in your life do you have a grief card that says, you can't tell me what to do. I'm the one who had someone die. It's the ultimate ace. So if you want to change things up, you can. I left the county. I went into private and hospice. I went into private practice. I redid who I am. I'm able to live a life I couldn't live before. I did it because of grief and loss. Because otherwise we're locked into our lives a lot of the time. And it opens up that door. So I teach my clients that grief is actually a growth process and that we're going to come out on the other side and they're not going to grieve forever. I never let a grief client leave my office feeling like they're going to feel like crap for the rest of their lives. I repeat that every session. Was that too much?
No, that was perfect. Thank you for that. How about, kind of factoring in what you had said earlier about, the pandemic?
Yeah.
How that may have influenced grief process or disrupted it or, cause it's so interesting now with this pandemic and even, the services, may not be for, further out, but like, what are your thoughts on how the pandemic has kind of mixed in with it?
The pandemic has made grieving so much harder and it's made so much more trauma for people who've had someone who has died of it because right now, people who are dying of COVID are dying in hospital units without their loved ones there. There is one or possibly two hospice units in the entire country that will allow a loved one in to someone who's dying of COVID, and they allow one person at a time. And how all of us picture death, ideally, is either we go to sleep and don't wake up, or our family is there and surrounding us. And they're dying in hospitals on vents. And they're dying while they're sedated as well. But the person who's not there with them can only imagine the scenes that they have seen on TV. And of course, TV and media pick up the terrible ones. They don't pick up the nurse who's sitting bedside. They don't pick up the nurse who actually is taking the time to do a thumbprint and taking a lock of hair and everybody on the unit signing it and giving it to the family after that person has left the unit to go to the morgue. They don't have that image. And so there's a whole lot of reworking. And then there's an extended grief process because they can't have a funeral. Or if they do, they're going to have a really short little one where nobody can touch each other. And so part of what I do with people who are losing someone from COVID is, okay, you had a short funeral. When this is over, what are you going to do so that you can really mark the loss and have a public grief moment? How are you going to make sure that you have had that time? Because that's part of how people do it. We have Neanderthal graves that they have found now. We have graves that are 3,000 years old, and there are flowers surrounding the dead person, and they're holding something that mattered to them, which means there was a group process when that person died, and they gathered together to bury them. So we do this as a group. We always have. And when someone dies of COVID and someone else is sick with it, they get notified from outside the house, 10 feet away by phone. Nobody who's not regularly part of the house can be in the house. You can't have, the typical stuff. But what we can do, we can suggest that those around those people do the other things that come with death. Bring the funeral potatoes, right? Bring the casserole that's frozen in a tinfoil dish so they don't have to save it for you. Crock pots are out. Don't do that. That's mean. We can send the cards. We can call them and say the name because people want to hear the loved one's name. And if you watch the movie Coco, they got it spot on. That's how you do it. You say their name and you remember them on important days. We've got Father's Day coming up. If you know anyone who's lost a father on your caseload or in your life, Father's Day is the day they need to be reminded they had a dad. And if they didn't have a good dad, Father's Day is the day they need to have that marked too. That was a loss in their life.
And thank you for sharing, what we don't see and what a lot of people don't see when it comes to that whole what's going on in the hospital now, because you're right. Like what we see on the news is the same old thing, and it's not the complete picture. There's so much more going on.
Right. And then they also see the images of the trucks, like in New York City, the refrigerator trucks. And let me just say, as the wife of someone who was serving with those trucks, the people who are being held there until they can be processed out, where no matter where you are in the country, are being treated with great respect and dignity. Those are funeral professionals, and they're taking good care of them. I think folks need to hear that rather than thinking their loved one is being tossed around in a bag. But it does extend you can't have a funeral on time because there are too many people dying. You can't go to the cemetery. Our local cemetery, you have to stay on the outside street and then watch the burial from there. You can't be there with them. That's a problem if you're Jewish, because you're supposed to be able to participate in burying your dead. And you're supposed to sit Shiva together, and you can't have people over. So it's impacted a lot of the parts of the rituals we need around grief, and we need rituals. And as therapists, we need rituals. If we lose a client, and a lot of us are, we need a ritual of our own to remember that client and to honor them, and not to do this whole, they were just a client, I've got my professional space. No, that was somebody whose life you impacted and who probably impacted yours in some way, and you need to honor it.
Yeah. And what does that look like, the rituals, or the ritual?
For me, when I lose a client, I typically take some time out, light a candle, remember the things that were special about them. I have a book of success that I keep. My friend Joe Muirhead from Australia created it. And you use that for the thank you cards and the great moments you have in your career. In part of mine, I also keep track of the clients of mine who've mattered, who've died. It's my journal. No one's going to see it. It's not breaching confidentiality. It doesn't leave my office. But it's my place to remember something special about that person. Did they come in every day and every week and look for Adele and put her on their lap? Did they do amazing artwork? What things did they do great work and change their lives? I put those things in there. It's not a lot. It's not a book. It's a couple of sentences, but it's my way of remembering them.
Yeah.
And if I'm out with my staff, and someone that I have worked with has died, I will share someone has died. I won't share their information, but I'm having a moment because someone that I worked with has just lost their life. That matters.
It does. And it's important also, for the person who, is grieving, to still take those moments, that it's okay, cause going back to earlier too, what other people say or do, or I know something I've heard before too, is just not talking about it. So that's also, or like, or someone say bringing it up and then like, there's just not, it just kind of stops. Like there's no talking about the feelings or the thoughts or.
If you don't talk about it, your loved one has not died, they've disappeared. It's like body snatchers came and they never existed.
Yeah. Yeah. And so having those, reflection time is so, so good,
Every
allowing yourself
Christmas,
to
I
also.
talk to my grief clients about what ornament have you made for the tree, right? Do you have a funny picture of them on it or a serious one or a special one? Our Christmas tree is filled with pets who've died and people who've died. I've got the one from my first wife has got a picture that she hated that I loved, and it was a funny picture. So that goes up every year. We talk about the funny stuff. It's not a grief moment. It's a happy memory moment. It's making them part of our life as we move forward. But it's important to say their names.
Right.
And if you're working with a grief client, make sure you remember the person who died's name so that when they come in and you start talking, you can say Mark, not your husband, or Debbie, not your wife, or Susie, not your child. Make sure you've got that name in front of you.
Yeah. Yeah. So we have, we're almost out of time, but before we end, is there anything else like you'd like, the listeners to know or like, take away from this episode and grief?
I'd like us to all be really cognizant, especially right now, that grief is surrounding us. We've got COVID, and now we've also got the civil rights issues and the losses that we're seeing experienced nationwide in the African American community. We need to be talking about it. We don't wait for our clients to bring it up. We bring it up. There's some controversy in the therapy community. It's not controversial to me. I bring it up. And my clients, without exception, appreciate it. And if they don't want to talk about it, they'll say, Jill, not today. Okay, that's fine. We don't have to. Just wanted to make sure it was a safe space for you. And I want all of us to remember that grief is a process. It's not a place to live. And also that if you don't do it right, your client is never going to go find another grief therapist. 70% of the population will never go to a grief group. And so they go to see a grief therapist. And if we blow it, if we run into the therapist like I ran into after my wife died, 2 therapists, both of them, one after each wife, didn't know what to do with me. They used the miracle question. Don't ever do that when someone's died because there's only one answer.
Right.
As the therapist, we don't have that power, right? They're cremated. You can't bring them back. And after 2 spouses have died, it would be crowded. So you need to know how to hold the space and what things not to say. Just not saying anything is better than saying things that aren't okay to say. Let your client take the lead, but make sure they feel hopeful. It's a process. It's part of life. We're surrounded by loss all the time. If we can see it as part of life and part of our own growth process, it's not scary. Death doesn't have to be scary. Neither does loss. It didn't used to be. It used to be something we did at home. And now it's become this other big thing. And with COVID, it's become ICU units and respirators. It doesn't necessarily have to be that unless it's COVID, in which case you just got to cope with what's happened.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
And thank you for bringing up, what's going on right now with, the protesting, because that it's very real, it's happening. Me too, as I've seen clients, I've definitely, checked in on them like right at the start, because it's not like, oh, what's happened in the past week? We know what's happened. We know, what's going on.
And it's overwhelming. Yeah. And if we have clients who are really identifying with it, what I'm finding is there are other incidents in their past that they should have dealt with and they didn't feel like they had a place to do it or safe space to do it. So there's a lot of grief in that, and we need to be prepared to catch that and honor that. If someone says their dog died, pay attention. They lost someone that's in their family. But if someone's dealing with the racial injustices going on, deal with that too. They're not equivalent. They're all separate. So don't hear me making them equivalent. But every loss is a real loss and needs to be dealt with that way.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
And don't forget the clients need to know you can let go of your grieving.
Yes. It's actually, you're right. It is very important. It's not always just sad, and I think that may be another misconception that people might have, is not being
Mm-hmm.
allowed to laugh or that's not okay, when really it is.
Yep. I used to tell people you can still go to Disneyland. I don't tell them that anymore, but I do say you can go out and enjoy the sunshine.
Well, before we end, as far as your book, where can people find it?
You can find me on Amazon. I have 2 children's books out, one about what somebody is dying, another one about someone has already died, one about pet loss, and then I have the workbook, Your Own Path Through Grief, and those are all on Amazon. And hopefully in the next few months, the really big book is coming out called The Rebellious Widow, which is all about breaking the grief rules and how to do grief in a solution-focused way if you've lost a spouse. It's all Jill.
Nice.
The kids' books all have poodles in them, by the way. Poodles go everywhere in our world, and they go to funeral homes too.
And if the listeners, want to find out more about you, is there like a website or anything that maybe they could go to if they wanted to find out more?
I am a .com now. Go to www.jilljohnsonyoung.com and you will find me. And on there, you'll find the links to all the other places because I'm all over Facebook. I have an Instagram that I don't know how I'm using. I have a 20-year-old VA who takes care of that for me. But we talk about what I want up and then she makes the magic happen because she's 20 and I'm not. And then I'm on LinkedIn and all those places too. But if you go to the .com, you'll find all the other places there.
Great. And I'll also,
and you can find my email there too, so you can link to me. Yeah.
Great. And I will also, this episode will be on our website, and then I'll put your information on there.
Thank you for having me. I hope you have a good weekend, and I hope everyone remembers to be there for your clients and to say the name.
Thanks for listening. Hopefully this was informative or helpful. The information of today's guest and their book can be found at the podcast website, booksbetweensessions.com. If you have any book suggestions or books you would like discussed on this podcast, please send us a message on the contact page of the podcast website. And if you're an author who has written a book that includes mental health or mental illness topics, and you would like to be on this podcast, please contact us through the contact page of the podcast website, booksbetweensessions.com. Also, this podcast is not psychotherapy or counseling. If you need to speak with a professional, you should find one local to you and contact them directly. If this is an emergency, please call your local emergency number or go to your nearest emergency department.